Welcome to anybody who's listening. Jeff Hainstyles. We're trying to bring in Richard Alley and the other people who have signed up for the event. Hoping to start at 1 o'clock Eastern. And just sending the URL to Richard. I'm not seeing Richard at the moment. I'm seeing it's 12:58, so there's a couple of minutes before the broadcast should officially start. I'm seeing some people linking in at the bottom of the screen. Hello, Rusty. How are you? Can you hear me?
Hi. I'm fine. The URL you just sent, is that the same that people have?
It's the one that is linked in from the Google Plus page. Yes, it should be the identical page.
Okay, great.
Here is Arturo linking in, but I'm not yet hearing Richard linking in. And I'm passing Richard into the main screen, so I'm hoping that everybody can see that. Say something.
Oh, I'm here. A little bit of static coming from somewhere, but I hope we're working.
We're working. Arturo, it may well be you. Again, so could you mute the microphone, please?
Yeah, I am muting the microphone right now.
Okay. No, not Richard. Don't mute your microphone. I'm asking Arturo to mute his microphone. Yes, I'm now seeing that Arturo has muted his microphone and Richard is there.
Yep.
I'm seeing that Climate and Crisis joined the chat and then went away. That is Rusty, I believe. So there are 7 viewers that are out there, but I'm not seeing anybody else in the LinkedIn version. So maybe we should just spend a few moments waiting for people to join in.
Okay.
But it's now 1 o'clock, and those of you who are listening remotely, this is the Earth the Operator's Manual interaction with Richard Alley, and we'll be going forward very soon. I'm Jeff Hainstyles. I'm the executive producer and writer of Earth the Operator's Manual, and I'll be acting as VJ for this activity. We've got some questions that have come in advance, and we'll be queuing those up if we don't have other people linking in live. Why don't we actually answer one of those questions, Richard, while we're waiting to see if more people come in. I will read that. This is similar to a question that had come in yesterday. How do we, and this is from Joshua Price, how do we make clean alternative energy sources not only economically viable, but appealing to those individuals of positions of power that have a vested interest in the fossil fuel markets? And this, he says, is not just a scientific question, it's a shift of power and money on a global scale. So not an easy question, but over to you, Richard.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. The answer is long, unfortunately, but in the really skinny version is first of all getting the word out about what's happening and about what the opportunities are, and the fact that this really can make more money, a lot more money. It can make more jobs. It can do all kinds of wonderful things. Second of all, we'll be getting the policies in the right places and getting things to work. It's a fantastic question. The answer is long, unfortunately. Right. I'm getting a very interesting feedback, Jeff. I'm not sure.
That's where that's coming from. Rusty, could you mute your microphone, please?
Are we okay now?
I'm not hearing that microphone feedback anymore. It sounds like the internet is giving us 2 or 3 or 4 more seconds between you and Rusty. But anyway, now it's quiet, so why don't you go ahead?
Now go ahead. Okay, so the next one would be getting the economics right. So at the modern time, the International Energy Agency just asked and said, how much are we subsidizing fossil fuels, and how much are we subsidizing renewables? And worldwide, they found that fossil fuel subsidies are very much bigger than renewable subsidies. We are spending lots and lots of money to keep fossil fuels cheap. They then looked at indirect subsidies, things like tax rates, and also looking at the ability to change the climate or to put particles in someone's lungs and what have you. And they found that we are grossly subsidizing fossil fuels more than we're subsidizing renewables, at the extent that in the IMF estimate, governments are spending the equivalent of 8% of their budget on fossil fuel subsidies. So if one were to get back closer to being fair to everything, the economics change a lot. There's this fascinating paper from Drew Shindell that just came out, which echoes several earlier papers that say if you were to remove the ability to put black soot into people's lungs without paying for it, or to dump mercury on people without paying for it, or some of these other things that are now not included in the cost of the fossil fuels, that the renewables would be much cheaper, especially than coal. And so if you can get the economics vaguely in balance, all of a sudden the renewables look way better.
Thanks, Richard. We've got folks listening in out there, and since it's almost 5 minutes past, why don't we assume that this is the beginning of the Hangout proper. We said that we were going to ask you to sort of give a state of play, a state of the union, state of the Earth system to start off with, and then go into the Q&A, which is, of course, what we want this to be all about. So why don't you go ahead, Richard, and just give us an update between the time that the book was written or the time the Team series went out on the air, and any significant changes in the Earth system in terms of climate science.
Absolutely. So first of all, thanks for showing up. It's a pleasure to see you, even if I don't see all of you. I'm staring at me and at Jeff, but I know you're out there. So thank you for coming. Brief update. There's really not that much that I had written in the book that would need to be changed a lot. CO2 is still a greenhouse gas. We are still putting a lot of it in the air. The world is warming. We have had a little window when more heat was going in the ocean and less into the air. Now maybe more is going back into the air. But the Earth system has continued to warm, and everything is running according to expectations. What's maybe ahead of expectations is that when we started on this, the promise, especially of solar energy, was out there, but it still looked like it was way out there because prices were still pretty high. And now you're seeing utilities starting to say, wait a minute, we're nervous about solar and wind because they're going to change our business model, because they're becoming cheap enough that they figure into our decision making and how we're going to run our coal plants and our nuclear plants. So the drop in price of solar energy and somewhat of wind energy has been, I think, the really surprising piece of the story. Other than that, the science has moved ahead that, yes, ice is melting. The science has become a little greater concern that if we do nothing about this, that it gets hot enough that it becomes difficult to live in places, that it becomes difficult to grow food in places. And so some of the sort of worst case scenarios have not gotten any better. The scholarship linking too much heat and too much drought to bad outcomes has strengthened. The military has been very clear that this is a national security issue. A group of retired military officers has drawn the dotted line that connects warming to drought to bad things in Syria and other places. So the sort of, if we do nothing, this looks worse in some ways, is strengthened. But the we can do things that look better has also strengthened.
Okay. There were a number of questions that came in about the developing versus the developed world, and that sort of touches on what you just said, Richard. Is climate change worse for the developing world or the developed world, and how do we bring the world together to begin to solve the issue? That's a number of questions that came in.
Yeah, and really good ones. If you have bulldozers, you can raise a wall against the sea or move things. If you have air conditioners, when it gets hotter, you can work in the summer, and you're not going to be really heat stressed on a hot night or something like that. So the people with stuff have an easier time. Furthermore, the people with stuff tend to be people who live where there's winter, and so we are a little bit more warmth is less costly to us. So it's very, very clear that the biggest dangers, the biggest damages come to poor people in hot places and to people in future generations. And the rich people in cold places now are in the best shape. That is maybe the biggest tension, which is if one tried to make the transition to renewables really fast and you tried to really hold down fossil fuels in a hurry, there will be some costs to poor people in hot places who are trying to get ahead. And it is still true that we get a lot of good out of fossil fuels as well as the bad. Still, if you think about a lot of poor places, well, history. When I was a kid and you wanted to talk on the phone, you had a phone and you had to stand next to the wall. And there is a copper wire that came into your house, and to make a phone call, you had to stand next to a wall next to the phone. And at the point where we got a long enough cord that you could go sit down while you were talking on the phone, this was a radical, new, wonderful thing for us. Much of the world will never put a copper wire into your house so you have to stand next to the wall and talk on the phone. They are going to jump right to cellular phones. They are jumping right to cellular phones. It is really possible that chunks of the world that is developing are going to jump right past coal plants and other centralized things with wires coming into your house and right to distributed, movable, customized energy, which really is likely to be renewable.
Thanks, Richard. So there's a lot of questions like the one that came in from Haley Bell, which I'm going to put in the chat, and I'm going to read it as well. What do you think should be done? What do you think is the most effective way to get people who don't believe in climate change to change their mind? There's so much scientific evidence, yet people and politicians refuse it.
Yeah, thanks, Haley. You're right. There is much evidence, and some people do refuse it. Some of it is different voices, and this was something that so I'm sitting here chatting with Jeff. This is something I really learned and refined from working with him, is that there are times and places that I, as a professor, can show up, and you will listen to me. Somebody will listen to me, and there are times that a rancher or an admiral or your next door neighbor is just way better. And that in turn means that there is a role for all of you who are out there, because you are a voice, and you are not my voice, and you are not Jeff's voice, and you are not the admiral's voice. You are your voice, and that makes you very important. I think the additional piece is to tell the good of the story. I have not gone out and validated this, but there's a piece that runs around which I believe is accurate, that one of our prominent senators who is very anti doing something about global warming once said that he believed in doing something until he found out how much it would cost. Now, in fact, ignoring it costs more. And the point where doing something about this not only gives you a cleaner environment, not only goes with the golden rule, not only takes out insurance against disaster, but it actually makes money compared to ignoring it. That particular piece of the story is very rarely told. There's a lot of people estimating the costs of making the change and ignoring the benefits. And of course, the equivalent would be, wow, I have a hole in my roof because some worker was up there fixing the antenna and they dropped something through, right? Okay, it will cost me a lot to fix the hole in my roof. Maybe I should invest the money in the stock market instead. No, you look up and you say, sure, it'll cost me something to fix it, but the benefits of fixing that will exceed the costs. I will be better off by fixing the hole in my roof. We have a lot of things in public discourse that assume that there's no benefit of fixing the hole in the roof. And we need to get out the good of this and do it with a lot of voices, and that undoubtedly will include yours.
So this goes to that question, since obviously a lot of the people linking in are students. And Ryan O'Neill said, since many youth and teenagers around the world don't seem to care about the effects of global warming and climate change, my question to you would be, what's the best way to inform the youth about climate change and the effect it will have on their future in a way that makes them care about the subject and want to do something to change how we're living today so we can all have a better future? Some of the other questions that came in did say there's a difference between the United States and many other countries. So maybe it's not fair to say that youth all around the world doesn't necessarily care about it. So there's two related questions, engaging youth and differences between different nations.
Yeah, so I do think that a lot of youth get it, and I suspect that a lot more will in the future. A lot of this is looking for the win-wins, the things that move forward. Slightly long story, but I'll keep it short. A number of years ago, our younger daughter was doing a little film on surface mining, strip mining, coal mining. And she succeeded, while she was in middle school, in getting my wife and I and our two daughters into the cab of a dragline, this giant shovel taking apart a mountain. And we sat there in the cab of this giant shovel taking apart a mountain. Well, a guy with two joysticks took apart the mountain. And he's like playing a video game, except he's taking apart the mountain. And, we talked to him for a while, and I'm shortening it, but he said basically, I got a good job, and there's 3 more guys that run this, and there's somebody that greases it, and somebody drives the truck, and somebody sets the dynamite, and these are fine jobs, but that's sort of it. It's not a lot of jobs. There used to be a huge number of jobs down in the hole that were really bad, and people tended to die when the roof caved in on them, but now we've got just a few jobs. And the scholarship that I've seen says that we end up with more jobs if we deal with this. This is the future. I was given a talk once to a bunch of federal employees in the U.S., and one person said, look, I get this, I understand, I know the problem, but I'm from a coal town, and this is going to be bad for my coal town. And I said, yeah, it is, in the short term. But I said, you're sitting next to somebody who is a park ranger at the C&O Canal. Now, those of you who don't know, after the Revolution, George Washington is out saying, we need canals. We need to bring the goods of the West to the East Coast. And we built canals, and one of those was the C&O. I think it's the Chesapeake in Ohio. But at any rate, they built the C&O Canal, and the government helped build canals. They made it possible. They made it happen. And at some point, they said, you know something? This canal is never going to make it to Utah. We need railroads. And we know that when we build the railroads, and we help build the railroads, yeah, there's a few canal workers who are going to be unhappy. But the day comes that the future is going to be railroads, and it's going to be interstates, and it's going to be airports. And we can't just say we're stuck with the canal forever. And they did. They built something new. This is the future. This is jobs. This is the economy. This is, and if you're listening to this and you're a student now, you're going to live to the point where the warming gets really big and really frightening unless we do something. So I think a lot of the opportunities here, there's a threat of doing nothing, but there's a huge opportunity of doing something. And it will be, this is the future. We either can take the tops off all the mountains, burn the coal, and then put renewables on top of what we did, or we can put the renewables out now. There's not a third choice. We have to move to renewables. The only question is how fast we do it.
One of Richard's public talks is called Get Rich and Save the World. And so that's about careers and it's about opportunities, and that's certainly one of the things that he thinks about. We know that a fair number of viewers, listeners, interactors are from Nebraska, and a couple of questions have come in that relate to agriculture. So one of them from Adam Buckley, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, hopefully not mangling it too much, says, will biofuels really be that efficient in the future? As Earth's population continues to grow, there will be an increase in demand for agriculture and land use for growing crops. So my question is, will biofuels really be that efficient and cheap in the future due to population increase?
Yeah, great question, Adam, and good to see you, and hi to you, good people in Nebraska. Way back when, for just a little while, I was an employee of a group at the University of Nebraska. We went to Greenland and drilled ice cores together. So, at any rate, it's a great place and nice to see you. My gut feeling is that we will end up using some biofuels, carefully targeted ones, for quite a while. And in particular, it's going to be hard to replace jet fuel with batteries in the short term. And so we likely will see some sort of bio fuel to run the planes. We may see biodiesel in some tractors for a while. It will be much easier to do cars with batteries than it will heavy haul tractors and trucks. So my guess is you will see some targeted biofuels doing the jobs of jet fuel and heavy duty equipment. You may see for a while that if you watch the TV shows, the film of doing ethanol from Brazil, they have made that work pretty well, and it's a very impressive thing to see. But ultimately, we're going to have a few more billion people on the earth in all likelihood, and they're going to be hungry. And ultimately, I just can't see us burning a lot of food for fuel in a hungry world. I eventually see the fields of Nebraska and the fields of Iowa and the fields of Ohio and, yes, the fields of Pennsylvania going to feed people and not going to fuel. The net gain of ethanol now is not huge. The energy, they talk about the energy return on energy invested, and it's pretty low. It takes almost as much energy to get a gallon of gasoline as you get from the gallon of gasoline when you're doing it with ethanol. And so in a hungry world, that's going to be an issue. I read a paper once on some economists from New Zealand pointing out how our corn ethanol was helping their agricultural economy by raising the prices. And so my guess is you'll see targeted biofuels, but that mostly biofuel is going to mean what it always meant, which is lunch.
Okay, we have another question that also relates to agriculture, and it's from, let me see, I'm just going to send it into the chat screen, and it's from Dalton Obermeyer. I guess this isn't really a question, just want to hear your personal opinion on beef production. High topic, high emissions. I know that whenever we put something about foodstuffs on the Facebook page, the Earth the Operator's Manual Facebook page, we always get a lot of interaction. So Dalton says, people are blaming cows for pollution, and I want to hear your thoughts, basically. So
yeah, great question. A touchy one, one that one needs to work with carefully. For a very long time, we used cows and goats and sheep and what have you as ways to turn things that eat into things we can. So I can guarantee you, if you spent the summer eating grass in the front yard, you would be very unhealthy in the fall unless you ate a lot of other things as well. We can't turn grass into us. But lands that are not croplands and that don't grow much that we can eat has been fantastically useful to us. And there's absolutely no question around the world that we prime places for crops, and we grew crops on them. marginal places and we had animals eat grass, and that works fine. At the point where you say, we're going to grow food that could be human food, we are growing soybeans, we are growing corn, we are growing other things that we could eat. And now we are going to take what we could eat and give it to cattle and let them turn it into something we can eat. The cow has to keep him or herself alive. And so some of the energy in that food goes to the metabolism of the animal, and so less eventually gets to us. It may be higher quality in some sense, it's protein, it's more nutritious, but less energy gets to us, especially since you have to go harvest that food, haul it to where the cow eats it, the cattle eat it, let them eat it, and then take them and haul them to us and refrigerate them on the way. So it is very clear in purely feeding people that once you switch from feeding grass to the cattle to feeding our food to the cattle, that there's less total food available. And in a hungry world, long term, we're gonna eat lower on the food chain in all likelihood because of that issue. And then in addition, it will lower climate change. But that's not where I would start the discussion. I don't think we're ever going to really all turn into vegans. I think we're likely to be eating some meat for a very long time. And I personally think that if you start the discussion with, we're coming to take away your steak, that often ends the discussion right then. And I don't think anyone really is coming to take away the steak. What we're thinking of is making the prices reflect the costs and then letting people make decisions. And it is virtually across the board. You're a student, this probably is not an issue yet, Dalton, but there will be an issue in not that many years when a little less steak and a little more beans and chicken is probably going to be better for you. And so that, I suspect that's the direction you'll see.
So this is pulling together a number of thoughts that are out there in the questions that have been coming in. And it's really something that comes out of what you just said. How do you begin the question, how do you begin the conversation with skeptics? And in the book, you have a couple of chapters that I think are entitled, But My Brother-in-Law Says. And we have a number of videos online which we cheekily call How to Talk to an Ostrich. And you wouldn't want to tell an ostrich that they're an ostrich because then they'd be upset. So the question more generally is, when you find yourself interacting with folks who are skeptical of what you believe to be scientific facts, how do you have a conversation which is productive rather than unproductive?
Yeah, and it's really hard. It has to come from respect. But I think the mere fact that all of you are out there listening today, you can come from respect. So it is, I have family members who were not always completely simpatico with what I'm doing here. So one has to start from respect right away. And then you have to find sort of where the person to whom you're talking wants to go with this. And I have met people who really desperately do care about some particular technical piece of the story, in which case you talk about that. So if they really don't believe CO2 is a greenhouse gas, it's pretty easy. We go to the heat-seeking missiles in the Air Force and the fact that the physics of that the greenhouse gas is being used every day out there by military people trying to protect us. So if they care about the particular technical thing, my suspicion is that usually this has much more to do with my group versus your group, or my view on how we move people towards the future versus yours. And so sort of keeping the discussion going just long enough that you can find out where the issues are, then you can go to them. Because the basic picture, ignoring this costs more than dealing with it. Ignoring this loses jobs compared to dealing with this. Ignoring this hurts other people in ways that is not consistent with the golden rule at all compared to dealing with this. Ultimately all the pieces are there. It's a matter of how do you get to that without preaching at them and turning them off. And that's where, if you're doing it for television, you find somebody who's really, really good and work with them. If you're doing it with other people, you do it because you're good people and you can figure this out.
Okay, I'm just going to invite Nathan Provost to do whatever he did before, because he appeared as if he was going to ask a question, but then rapidly disappeared. So if Nathan is hearing this and is still interested in interacting directly with Richard, please come back online and do whatever you were doing. So there was a question which came in about the Vostok Ice Core, and I'll try and find out the name of that person in just a minute. But the question was, when you look at the Vostok Ice Core, you, Richard Alley, see clear evidence that there has been change in the past and there is change now. What do you say to skeptics who say, well, Earth is always changing, and today's change is nothing out of the ordinary?
Right. Earth has always had forest fires, but we still have arsonists. Earth has always had people die, but we care about murders. Earth has always had climate change, but we care about what we're doing as well. Now, the truth is, yes, Earth has always had climate changes. 300 years ago, geologists started drawing lines, and they said, wow, a bunch of things lived for a while, and then something changed, and a whole lot of them died, and other ones moved, and then new ones show up over a few million years. And they didn't know why those changes happened. They drew the line and said, wow, what lived got really hammered right here. And 200 or 300 years later, we know one of those lines is a meteorite that killed the dinosaurs, but the next line up is a big belch of CO2, and one of the next really big line down was a big belch of CO2. And we're starting to see that those lines where things died were nature changing CO2. And we could, if we sort of burn everything we can find, cause changes as big as that, but faster. And so the sort of people who have studied forest fires are probably more concerned about arson. People who've really studied Earth's climate history, I think, are more concerned about what we're doing to the climate because we've seen how influential it was in the past. I have given a talk at the meeting of the American Geophysical Union, which is online somewhere on YouTube, called The Biggest Control Knob, showing how the CO2 has actually been the most important of the many pieces that have driven those natural changes in climate, and that's how big our influence is. So it's one of those things, it's just, oh, it's always changed, don't worry. No one would ever say that. No one would ever say that about forest fires. It's always burned, so no worry about arson.
Okay, I think that's pretty good. That was actually a question from Benjamin Husvingkelt, and I'm sure I mangled that one. I apologize. But anyway, Benjamin, your question got over to Richard. Another one of the common statements is, it's just the sun. And that's come back several times on the Facebook page and questions that have come in through the website. So what do you say to people who say it's just the sun?
Yeah, for the last 30 years, we've had satellites watching the sun, and it's gotten slightly dimmer while the world warmed. So nature has been trying to cool it off by dimming the sun, and we have beaten it. There's a much longer answer, because as we go back, the sun does matter. And whenever the sun has changed over decades to centuries, even the sunspot cycles, the climate notices. We're just fortunate that the sun doesn't change that much. So if you took the sun and cranked it way up, we all fry. And if you crank it way down, we would all freeze if you did it fast. Interestingly, if you do it slowly, CO2 changes and it stabilizes the climate. And so the way back to Carl Sagan identifying the faint young sun paradox, that the Earth has had liquid water, we've been comfortable for a very long time, and yet the sun is slowly getting brighter because it burns hydrogen to helium that packs mass tighter in the sun, that increases the gravity, and that increases the fusion rate. And how did we not freeze way back when? And at least part of the answer is CO2 comes out of volcanoes, it reacts with rocks and makes shells. And the coming out of volcanoes doesn't care about the air temperature, it cares about the temperature way in the earth. The reacting with with rocks is chemistry. And chemistry, you have a Bunsen burner in Chem Lab for a very good reason. Chemistry goes faster when it's hotter. So when it gets cold, the CO2 builds up and warms us. And when it gets warm, the CO2 goes down. In a mere 500,000 years, nature stabilizes. And so this one is one that if the sun changes slowly, CO2 beats it. If the sun changes fast, it matters. But the sun doesn't change much. And recently, the sun is trying to cool off, but we're warming up.
Okay, that's another good question. What about the other statement that's always brought up that is basically that there's no evidence that it's humans that are doing it? Sorry, the one that comes out of the questions that have been asked from Rusty's class actually goes to CO2, that more CO2 in the atmosphere is good for plants because CO2 is what plants use for food, and therefore more CO2 must be good for agriculture.
Yeah, and hi Rusty, and hi Rusty's class, and I hope things are going well there. It is absolutely true. Plants like CO2, and our assessments of the future impacts include that effect. No one is ignoring it. But think about a plant for a minute. You're a plant, and you like CO2, but you want some fertilizer, but not too much. My dad used to kill my mom's flowers by over-fertilizing. And you want some water, but not too much, or you get flooded. And you need the right insects to pollinate you, but not the wrong ones to eat you. And it can't be too cold or you freeze, and it can't be too hot or you broil, and you can't have the wrong weeds. And, you know, to make a plant happy takes getting a whole bunch of things right. But you can kill a plant by freezing it, or broiling it, or flooding it, or drying it out, or over-fertilizing it, or under-fertilizing it, or eating it from the wrong bug, or out-competing it from the wrong plant. There's a huge number of ways to kill a plant. You give plants more CO2, they grow a little better. You get things wrong, and they grow a lot worse. And what we find as we look to the future is initially there is a little help from the CO2, but the changing climate, the changing invasive species, and other things, it's pretty clear that food production goes down because the other things beat out the effect of the rising CO2. And so, yeah, that.
Values or low values? High values?
High value, really high, a couple really high.
I think that Cameron, you just joined in. Do you have a question for Richard?
Like this cow. This cow would be perfect cow. You give me one down here, it's by cow. Give me a sample down here, here, and then through.
I see Richard's. I see Cameron's cow icon, but I didn't hear a question from him. So, anyway, let us know if you come up with a question.
Yep. Hi.
So the other one was about how do we know it's us? And I know that we have a video called "It's Us" that's online. It's one of the things that's been shared quite a lot online. But the idea is that, yes, CO2 may be rising. It could be the volcanoes. It could be belches of gas coming from the interior of the planet. What's the evidence that it's humans that are changing the climate?
A great question. And there's multiple lines of evidence, and you do it one way, and then you do it a different way, and you get the same answer. And the one way, the easy one, is people actually, some of my colleagues here at Penn State have gone around and measured how much CO2 comes out of volcanoes, and we know how much fossil fuel we're burning with pretty good accuracy, and we know how much CO2 is showing up in the atmosphere and going into the ocean. So you just do the bookkeeping. This much from volcanoes, 50 to 100 or maybe even 200 times more from our tailpipes. And so we are so much bigger than the volcanic source that there really isn't very much to talk about. Then there's the fingerprinting. And so one can go and ask of what's happening in the atmosphere. If the CO2 came from volcanoes, that you're not burning anything. If it's hot, it will fiery, but it's not actually burning dead plants to make the CO2. If it comes from fossil fuels, you're burning them, and that takes oxygen. And so oxygen is dropping just as CO2 is rising, and those two balance beautifully. In addition, if it comes from volcanoes, it has a little more of the heavy carbon-13 than if it comes from fossil fuels. And we're seeing that what's going into the air is coming from something that had been alive, because it's very scarce in the heavy carbon-13. In addition, there's radioactive carbon-14, which is in plants and in the ocean, but it's not in fossil fuels, and we see that what's added to the air does not have that radioactive carbon-14. So these tracers, the oxygen and the carbon isotopes, say that it's coming from burning of something that was alive and has been dead a long time. And so that matches the bookkeeping just beautifully. Yes, the rise is us burning fossil fuels, and the confidence in that is really, really high.
So that little explanation runs on video maybe 3 minutes, and because it's based on isotopes and chemistry and physics, it's not got any politics to do with it, it's not got any opinion to do with it, you don't have to believe in it or not, it's just simple physics and chemistry. So that's putting a little bit of a political spin on it, but when people say, Richard, and this is another question that came in, do you believe in climate change? And I guess you could put the quote marks around the believe. How do you answer that?
Right. It comes from the physics. We can't get away from it. And so we believe in climate change sort of like we believe in this will fall down. You know, it's at some level we believe in physics. Gravity is a theory, and we don't have a complete theory of gravity, and we can't quite get Einstein to work with quantum mechanics yet, and so there's a lot of science to be done on gravity. But saying that you believe in gravity sounds just a little bit silly. Saying you believe in the warming influence of our greenhouse gases is really just about equally silly. So we use that word sometimes as a shorthand that we believe in it, but it isn't really something you believe in. It is something that arises from the fundamental physics that we can't make go away.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about climate science. Let's go back to some of the other things that are obviously on students' minds. And one of them is about solar energy. So I'm just sending you a question that came in from Jordan Swan. What do you recommend as being an efficient way for solar energy to be stored to then be dispersed to the everyday folks so it can be used to be affordable to people? So that's a really big question, which is often brought up in skepticism about whether solar energy can do the job that's required to help replace the fossil fuel system. I'm going to ask you some other questions that relate to energy and the capacity of alternative energies to be other than alternative in future. But first one is solar energy and storage, battery storage or other storage.
Yeah, so great question, Jordan. There is a huge room for making better batteries. There's huge room for figuring out storage better. It will be useful. It will be valuable. The people that run the energy grids, the electric grids, have always dealt with changing supply. Sometimes the plant needs to be maintained, sometimes the plant breaks, and they have always dealt with changing demand. The customer wants more, weather changed, it got hot, it got cold, what have you. People go to bed, people get up, people go to the bathroom during the Super Bowl, whatever it is. Okay, so dealing with fluctuations is part and parcel of running an electric grid, and they always have. As you add renewables, you add some fluctuations, and that makes it harder, but it is not qualitatively different. This is not a completely new challenge than they have ever faced. It is just making a little more challenge the things that they've already been doing. When I started on this, when we got together at the end of 2009, the received wisdom, people kept saying no one will ever get more than 20% renewables on the grid without huge amounts of storage. It just can't be done. And in many places they have gone past 20% without blinking very fast. And so in that sense, we're learning. If you integrate a larger area, you integrate wind with sun, for example, you can handle a lot more of this. If you switch from coal to gas, you can now build a lot more in the way of renewables, because in general the coal plants are designed in a way that if this morning there isn't much demand for energy and this afternoon there will be, they can't turn the coal plant down for the morning. It doesn't work that way. It needs to be kept running full blast. And so they will throw away free wind to burn Pennsylvania to get with expensive coal because their plant can't handle it. If you go to gas, now you can do a lot more wind. Eventually, we will almost certainly have some storage on the grid. It could be pumped hydro. You build a dam, the water comes down the dam when you want power. When you have extra power, you pump it back up the dam. It could be using electricity and water and CO2 and making new fossil fuels. Not fossil, but making new fuels and storing it that way. One that we talked about a little bit in the book, and keep it in mind, suppose a lot of people buy plug-in hybrid cars. You put a little biodiesel on and you've got a battery. And suppose we build an electric grid that is smart enough that when the grid needs a little extra power, it can buy it from your battery. And you still have your biofuel, so you'll still be able to drive. But now they have to pay you sometimes. You're part of the storage, and your electric rate will be lower, or you'll be making money because you have agreed to let them use your battery. In the time it takes for everyone to buy a new car, there's an immense number of batteries now in the system. And when your battery in your car is finally tired, it's not completely dead. Somebody can rack those up in big buildings, use them for a while, and then recycle. And so in the time it takes for everyone 20 years or so to go through new cars, you would have an immense number of batteries. And the batteries are already starting to compete in many parts of the world with other cars. If they were part of stabilizing the grid, they'd be more valuable, they'd compete better. So you're seeing a lot of improvements in batteries, and it will be smart things like that that are likely to make it work.
So in the second program, we did some filming in Kodiak, actually in the third program, in Kodiak Island, Alaska, which has a very big dam on a high point, and they do exactly what Richard is talking about. They hope that a combination of wind power and hydroelectric power will power the entire island, and they use the downward pressure of the water from the dam to fill in when the wind is not sufficient to give them what they need. So that's there. There's another question that came in that's related to that. At the end of the first program, we have a number of pie charts which show what the balance of fossil fuels, nuclear, renewables, etc. are currently, and what they might be in the future. And we did say one plan, which I think comes out of Mark Jacobson at Stanford, said you could power the entire world on water, meaning both hydro and wave power in the ocean, solar, and wind. And so Adam Lawson asked the question, do you think the entire Earth can cease their dependence on fossil fuels and transfer to completely renewable energy? If so, could we aggressively start the transition process today? That's from Adam.
So great question, Adam. First of all, yes, we can. Second of all, that is really good, because if we can't, we're in deep doo-doo. So we're burning fossil fuels now about 1 million times faster than nature saved them for us. The rate at which new ones are being formed is so close to zero that if you call it zero, that's fine. And so either we have to make the switch to renewables, or we are in huge trouble. We walk in the book and in the TV shows, we walk through the fact that our ancestors, when there were 1% as many as we have now, trees did not grow fast enough to power them. They burned all the trees and they were gone. And yes, more trees are growing back, but they're burning them way faster than they grew back. We are burning fossil fuels way, 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 way faster than they grow back. And so we have to switch. The choices are either we burn all the fossil fuels and then we burn renewables, put renewables on top in a harder to live in world, or we start the switch now. And we know how to do it now. And I have a set of plots that I show in talks now occasionally. I put up a map showing where we grow our food and where we have animals grazing on grass to make food. And a big chunk of the world is colored. And then I put up how much more area in a low-latitude solar farm with existing technology would be needed to give all the energy that we humans now use? And it's a little tiny square compared to where we get our food. So we can do this. There's absolutely no question. The sun is the biggest one, and sort of 1/100th of 1% of the sun reaching the top of our atmosphere would power all of humanity. Wind, sort of 1% of the sun goes into wind, so it's still way bigger than what we need. A wind farm on the windy parts of the plains and deserts of the world is way more energy than we use. Water, waves and currents get 1% of the wind. They're not big enough by themselves, but they help. And if you're going to build a breakwater to keep the storm waves out of your city, why not put a generator on it and use that energy? And it will damp the waves better, and you can get money out of it. So things like that will be smart. A little geothermal is likely, some hot, dry rock, and a little biofuel. So plants are the old way to do solar, and our modern ones are way more efficient than plants, but plants do some interesting biochemistry that we can't do with a silicon yet.
So there's a question that relates to that that comes in from Olivia. And she asked, what kinds of steps politically and socially do you think we would need to take to get fellow Americans on board for changing our energy sources, which you've answered to some extent, but what the question adds onto that, what about developing countries that are just starting to use fossil fuels? So that goes to the question about, is it one size fits all, what to do about China, which is rapidly advancing out of poverty and using coal to help generate energy, but also creating incredible pollution and air quality issues, and nations like India, where the emissions are going up, but the emissions per person are still very low. And I have to say, the single most popular post on our Facebook page ever talked about how Narendra Modi, who used to be the head of the Gujarat state government and now is the Prime Minister of India, had endorsed the idea of putting solar covers on top of canals to both generate energy and to reduce the evaporation. And that was something that people obviously responded to. So the question is, developing nations, how might they work?
Thanks for the question, Olivia. Amanda, if your microphone is not muted, thank you. But don't leave us. Just mute the microphone.
Completely, but come back, Amanda, and just
please do. Yeah, don't leave us at all. We just yes. So at any rate, thanks for that, Olivia. There's so many answers to that, and you or any individual or any group can't do all of them. There's the big overarching answer, and the economists would say what we should be doing is making the price of fossil fuels reflect the cost. And that means getting rid of the big subsidies for it and getting rid of the ability to change someone's climate and have them suffer from that without including that in the cost. And right now, I started off, and some of you were on and some not, but I started off on a scale of panic about global warming to do nothing about global warming. We're over here someplace as make it go faster, because there's a lot of subsidies to make global warming go faster. And so getting the price to reflect the cost is the single thing that the economists to whom I've spoken say over and over and over again. And they would say put a price on carbon and use that to reduce the price on something else, like your paycheck, and do something good with the money that you raise. And so they sort of love that as an answer, is make the price reflective of the true cost. Then there's the other sorts of things, such as inventing the new way. There's going to be a huge number of inventions, making them work, founding the business that works. And once it works for you, it can work overseas too. There are studies that are done. The German researchers and the German government looked, for example, at the costs and benefits of making this transition to renewables. And they said very broadly, it just really is not that costly. But the early adopters are likely to make a lot of money because they will found the companies, they will get the patents and the inventions that drive the future. And it will be a future that will be sold all around the world. So there's a huge number of things of how do you make it work for people. And I'll put in a shameless plug. The second and third programs, in Earth the Operator's Manual especially, have these fantastic stories of making it work for people. And this involves renewable energy in Alaska, it involves conservation in Kansas and in Baltimore, it involves all sorts of things showing how it works for people so that they're making money as well as getting a cleaner environment. And so there's a huge number of things that sort of bubble up from below, and then these big things that come down from above that will have voters and others behind them.
So a number of folks ask questions which are basically, what should I personally do? And I know that question comes up, when we've done public presentations in Portland and in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and so forth. People will say, okay, well, we understand the science, we know the promise of renewable energy, but what should I personally do? And it's a pretty unfair question, but we might as well pass it along to Richard and say, well, what should we do?
What should we do? Okay, so you will decide, and you will decide in a way that works for you, and I won't tell you what to do. No one made me king for a day. But first of all, don't panic. Your ability to do good is much larger than your great-grandmother's ability to do good. Your great-grandmother, if she kept the kids fed and she was the third best lap dulcimer player in the west end of the valley, she felt real good about herself. And if you invent the new thing, or you start the new business, or you write the new whatever, you might feel miserable about yourself, because while your ability to help people has gone up, your knowledge of the problem has gone up faster. So don't panic. First of all, we can do this. You can do this. You can't solve everything, but you can make a difference. After that, I think it's a couple of things. One is to do what helps the big picture, which will be voting and talking to your neighbors. And the other one is pick something or a couple of things that you feel good about and try to help as an individual. And you don't have to solve everything. But if you're doing the big picture thing and you're doing something so your neighbors can see that it works for you, you'll be making a difference. All of us as individuals have some cost to the planet. We can't be here without having an impact. But we all have some benefit of contributing to the intellectual commons, contributing to the knowledge of how to get along and how to do the good things. And if you do a little more good than your impact on the planet, you have helped. And so find something that works for you, and find something that works with your community, and you'll be a hero at the end of the day.
So we had a new question that came in from Cameron. We muted his mic beforehand because it was making a lot of noise, but if he's there and available to ask the question, feel free to do it. Otherwise, Richard, do you see it in the chat window?
Yeah. So hi, Cameron, and glad you popped in. Okay. Change for better. Okay. So with all the data collection services, climate modeling, and the world technology, my gut feeling is that the most useful tool is going to be getting the economic benefits of dealing with this widely known. The jobs, the things that come out of those, and that it's actually going to be your wallet, not your satellite. And I know that's a fuzzy story, but in the end, we have always known that there are problems out there. We have always dealt with them. We have had crises, but we've ended up better off at the end. And pretending that I'm a liar and pretending that CO2 is not a greenhouse gas, we're driving into a dead end there. And pretending that we know the answers, we don't really know the answers, but we know that we can get where we're going. We know that the energy is there. We know that we're the first generation in history that can build a renewable, sustainable energy system. That we won't run out of trees, we won't run out of whales, we won't run out of coal. The sun will shine, the wind will blow, and we can get more energy out of that than we need. And it may look like things we're building today, and it may look a little different. It will have a lot of new companies. But that optimistic view, we can get off of a treadmill that has caused us troubles as long as we've been people. That's the most powerful tool we have.
Well, I believe that certain people have announced their entry into presidential politics, and we had a couple of questions, including this one from Samantha. I've noticed the central theme in environmental problems, especially here in the U.S., is that we don't have the policy to back up change. What do you think policymakers can do to make policies that change things in the long term, not just for the length of their time in office? And one of the other questions came in, does the limited term of politicians create a problem? Now, we said that Earthly Operator's Manual would try to be authoritative, apolitical, and so we don't take positions on things, but what do you make of that question, Richard, about policymakers?
Two very short stories. The first time that I testified to a subcommittee of the U.S. Senate, it was chaired by a Republican who wanted to put a price on carbon and who seemed a little unhappy with me that I wasn't scarier about the risks we face from global warming. And this was, I think it's now 13 years ago. So you know, what is now completely impossible was very, very possible not that long ago. The other very short story, the last time I talked to a group of senators, they seemed very, very frustrated. They actually seemed like they wanted to do things, but they needed some help from the voters. And so I think the biggest picture is if the good word gets out, it will give the senators the opportunity to do the right things and to help people. And so they need a little bit of cover to go with that, and that cover will have to come from the voters ultimately. So so this is, again, it's one that's doable, and like I said, the mere fact that 12, 13 years ago, what was politically likely was completely reversed. And be honest, 12 or 13 years ago, if anyone had told any of us in that room that any state in the Union would allow any two individuals of the same gender to get married, we would have laughed at you. That was so impossible. And so what's impossible changes in 10 years.
That sounds good. So we're just about at the end of our hour. We know that a lot of questions that came in advance have actually been answered, so hopefully that's good for folks out there. If anybody who's online wants to get into the chat window and send some more questions, we might have time for one or two more questions. But I'm going to ask one of Richard, just in case people need a little bit of time to think. And that was in the book, and this is a question that came in from somebody. You talk about how energy gets routed to different organs in the body, and I think that goes back to the thing that you talked about in terms of cooking being a way to actually get more energy out of foodstuffs than otherwise was possible just by chewing things like chimpanzees do, et cetera, et cetera. Talk a little bit about cooking as culture and civilization.
Oh my goodness, yes. So cooking is culture and civilization. It is very clear that we are who we are in part by getting help from outside. Eating food is a hard thing. To get more calories out of what you eat takes a longer gut, but keeping that alive is difficult. And so when our ancestors learned how to burn, they were able to do more. And this is part of us, and it is deeply ingrained in us. And people, try to get people to use a little solar oven rather than burning dung in their house, and it tastes different. And their food is so much a part of them that there's a cultural barrier there. And so what we do, how we cook, is really part of us. That's one of the reasons that you don't actually start with eating a little less steak in this discussion, even though eating a little less steak would be healthier for some of us, because the food is so deeply rooted in who we are and what we do. We get about 2,000 calories a day of food. In the U.S., outside of us, we have more than 100 times more energy than that from our fossil fuels and our renewables and our nuclear. So it's 2,000 inside of you, 240,000 outside of you. And a lot of that goes to getting that 2,000. So food is going to be huge in the future, but we need energy for food. And if we really want to keep eating what we want to eat, we have to start making the transition to renewables.
Okay, so next one is going to be the last question. It comes from Daniel Jaber. My question is, which countries are best prepared for the effects of climate change, and what are the factors that you think determine this? How will the residents and, quote, climate refugees, unquote, of countries that are impacted most by climate change cope in the next few decades?
All right. So the most prepared countries are those with winter bulldozers and air conditioners. If you got a big economy and you're in a cold place, you're in the best shape right now. The least prepared ones are poor people in hot places. And there's this tension that in the very short term, getting an air conditioner is a good way to prepare for warming, but in the long term, it may crank up the warming and make it worse. So that's the biggest tension that's out there. The issue of environmental refugees, at some level, they've always been with us, but we could have a lot more. And the fact that the military leaders are now drawing this dashed line, or this dotted line, between a warming planet and ISIS and the civil war in Syria is a very sobering thing. Very, very crudely, each degree of warming costs more than the previous one. We've warmed 1 degree. That one didn't cost a lot, but that is already linked to problems in the Middle East. We're committed to the next degree. We're arguing about the third and the fourth, and the second costs more than the first, and the third costs more than the second. We're up to the point now that failure to act starts to raise the cost really rapidly. But we can still avoid the big costs if we get busy on it.
Okay, so we're going to come to a close there, and I guess the last question for Richard would be, are you ultimately an optimist or a pessimist about our chances to move forward and solve what Randy Rusty's class would call the climate crisis?
Yeah, I'm ultimately an optimist. We will not do the most the optimal thing. We would have started more seriously 10 or 20 years ago, but we will muddle our way through. There are already, you can find a lot of things out there people are writing about existing utilities who are trying to hold down renewables because of the challenge to the business model. And that's a hugely optimistic thing. I don't think when I first met Jeff these few years ago, I don't think we would have believed that we would see this rapidly, that renewables were a challenge to an existing business model without a big help in policy. And they have gotten there without a big help in policy. So I think that the plummeting price of solar, the dropping price of wind, are really optimistic signs that not only can we do this, but we can do this faster than we thought. So the future is out there. It's going to be a good one. Thanks for showing up. It is always a pleasure to chat with all of you, and I hope to see you down the road.
That's great. There will be another Hangout on air on Earth Day next week. It will be announced on the Earthly Operators Manual G+ page. Thanks to everybody for sending in questions in advance and for participating. And thanks, obviously, to Richard. Take care, and good luck, everybody. Bye-bye.